So Genesis chapter 41, and we're going to be going from verse 37. And kind of our main theme for this time, if you want to kind of put it like a main kind of theme or focus, is really just being reminded that our God of the Bible, is a God of the great reversal. In essence, God is able to completely turn things on its head in an instant. And this is what we're going to see today as we go through our text. As I kind of mentioned last week, we saw the beginning of this chapter. And last week we saw Joseph say the words to Pharaoh, "It's not in me, God will give." In essence, this was Joseph's answer to Pharaoh's request for him to interpret his dreams. And Joseph says, "Hey, look, Pharaoh, the power to interpret your dream is not in me, but rather it's in God. Interpretation belongs to God. And in his grace, God, in this event, not only gives Pharaoh these dreams, but then God also gives the interpretation of these dreams. God lets Pharaoh know through Joseph what these dreams mean, and basically God is revealing the future to Pharaoh. You see, and basically Joseph explains what these dreams mean, and these dreams mean that there will be 7 years of plenty. Basically, there'll be 7 years of abundance. Where there's abundance in food and crops, there's plenty. But then these 7 years of plenty are going to be followed by 7 years of famine in the land of Egypt and beyond. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, a famine like no other. So Joseph explains this, but then Joseph then explains and gives a plan of salvation. And Joseph says, hey, look, save, store during the 7 years of plenty that you will survive during the years of famine. And Pharaoh hears Joseph's words, and now he responds. Now, on one side we have the powerful king of Egypt, and on the other side we have this lowly, imprisoned Hebrew slave. And now we get to see what takes place. So verse 37 of chapter 41 says this. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this? A man in whom is the Spirit of God." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you." Joseph did what all of his advisors and servants and all of Pharaoh's wise men and counselors, and what Pharaoh himself had failed to do, which was to interpret these dreams. But as we saw, Joseph didn't take credit for it, but rather he pointed Pharaoh to where the credit was due, and that was God. And we see here that even Pharaoh, in his limited understanding of the true God of Israel, describes here Joseph as a man in whom is the Spirit of God, and a man who God has shown all this to, and he describes him as a man who is discerning and wise, and these statements are true. And it's amazing that, as I say, Pharaoh, this guy who didn't know the true God, he worshipped a pantheon of gods, all the multiple Egyptian gods, and yet here's this humble Hebrew slave, Joseph, standing before Pharaoh, basically saying, my God did this. My God has interpreted these dreams. And it's perhaps not clear how much Pharaoh understands or gets, but what is very clear he understands is that there's something different about this Joseph. Something different about this Joseph and the God that he worships. And in essence, what we see is somebody who is unsaved, somebody who doesn't know the true living God, looking at somebody who does and being like, there's something different about you. And really the unsaved world around us, let's kind of think about ourselves as Christians today. The unsaved world around us, they should look and they should see something different about us Christians. And even if they don't fully understand what that is, they should see something different about us. And I think one of those main things is because as Christians, if you've put your faith and trust in Jesus, you've said you've turned away from sin, you put your faith in him, if you've done that, not only have you been forgiven of your sin, but you've received the gift of the Holy Spirit, God living inside of us. And if God lives inside of us, then surely there should be something different about us. A preacher, a pastor, a guy called Francis Chan, he says it this way in his book Forgotten God, which is a book all about the Holy Spirit. He says this: if it's true that the Spirit of God dwells in us and that our bodies are the Holy Spirit's temple, then shouldn't there be a huge difference between the person who has the Spirit of God living inside of him or her and the person who does not? I love that challenging quote. He says, hey, look, if we really have God living inside of us, surely we should look different than the world around us. And this is, I think, a challenge and a reminder to us that we, in essence, when thinking and reflecting about this in my own life, I was like, I want to be somebody where my life displays that God is with me, that God lives inside of me. In essence, my life is displaying the truth that Jesus lives inside of me. And how do we do that? I think it's really this step by step. It's a day by day thing where we choose day by day to fix our eyes on Jesus. Day by day to turn towards him, to seek him. And then as a result of that, there will be fruit from our lives. And as a result of that, the unsaved world should look at us and be like, there's something different about him. And when they say, hey, what is different about you? That can be an opportunity for us to say, Jesus. What's different about you? Why are you like this? Or how come you're like this? And you're like, hey, it's not me, it's Jesus. And in essence, in some ways, this is what Joseph is doing here. God is working in him and through him. And when the world around takes note, Joseph is like, hey, it's not me, it's God. This wisdom I have, this discernment I have, it's not from me, it's God, the true and living God who lives inside each of us if we put our faith and trust in him. Continuing on from verse 40, it says this. So Pharaoh acknowledges, hey, look, there's no one like you. Like, you are different. I've never seen anything like this. God working you in such a way. And then he says this, Pharaoh, to Joseph in verse 40, you shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh makes Joseph the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Now we need to take a moment to really marvel at what has just taken place. Right, that morning when Joseph woke up, he was a slave. He was in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and he had no idea when he woke up that by the end of that day, he would be the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Such a reversal of circumstances is incredible. Think of that for a second. Here is Joseph, prisoner, slave, his Egypt and his Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, Joseph, I'm going to raise you up to be second in charge of everything. In essence, there's only one more person more powerful than you in Egypt, and that's me, the king, Pharaoh. This is a dramatic reversal of circumstances. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's like too good to be true, and yet it is true. Because the God of the Bible is the God of the impossible. And in a moment, God changes everything. Joseph goes from a prison to a palace. From rags of a slave to the garments of a king. Verse 42 says, Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Years ago, for us it was chapters ago, for Joseph years ago, we saw Joseph stripped of his garment, stripped of the coat that his father had given him. It was stripped of him and taken away as his brothers sold him into slavery. And in this moment of great reversal, we now see him being clothed in new garments of fine linen. He's even given a bit of bling as they put some gold on his neck. And then it continues on. And he had, in verse 43, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, Bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. I mean, this is incredible. These scenes that we are reading of. And I wonder how Joseph must have felt in this moment. As Pharaoh says, I'm gonna do all of this for you. I imagine how Joseph must have felt, what he must have been thinking. I mean, I imagine he must have been thinking to himself, hey, is this really happening? Pinching himself, is this a dream? Can this be true? That I would be set free, that I would be given such authority, that I would be given a wife and a palace and the chance to build a life and a family. This is truly unheard of. And I was thinking about this today. What would be the equivalent today? And I thought to myself, the equivalent would be, imagine watching somebody homeless, somebody who's homeless and they're living on the streets one day. And then the next day, they're given a house, they're made a chief aide to the Prime Minister. I mean, that is, in essence, what is radically taking place here. And for me personally, part of my work is working with homeless people. And one of the things I know is that fixing homelessness is not an easy thing. There's such brokenness and difficulty. Some difficulties which may even mirror some of the things that Joseph was going through. And yet we see just in an instant this great reversal. And if that were to take place with somebody on the streets, just a great reversal to the degree that Joseph experiences, everybody around us would be like, whoa, that's insane. How on earth did that happen? And this account reminds us that God is able to change our circumstances beyond what we could have ever dreamed or imagined. Our God is a God of miracles. Our God is able. And yes, I want to say that doesn't mean that God is always going to act in the way that we want. And it doesn't mean that God is just going to make everything work for us and we're never going to experience any pain or difficulty. That isn't the story of the Bible. That's not the story of Joseph or what he goes through. Because we live in a broken world, we are going to go through times of difficulty. But as we see from here, and the whole of Joseph's story is that God is with us as believers in the difficulty. God is able to use the difficulty for a purpose, as we're beginning to see unfold even here, but we'll see unfold further on. But then God is able to do great reversals. God is able to enter into our situations and change it. God is able. As we see, he does this here with Joseph, where he turns everything on its head. Joseph, in verse 46, says this: Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. When we first read of Joseph, and I want to, this kind of throwaway comment, Joseph was 30 years old, we could maybe just read past that and kind of not really think about it, but think about that for a second. When we first read of Joseph in chapter 37, all those weeks ago, he was 17 years old. When we're introduced to him, the relationship he had with his brothers, and he had his own dreams, he was 17 years old. Now, assuming that not much time had passed between him having his dreams and his brothers selling him into slavery, it means that all the events that we've been looking at happened over a time span of 13 years. 13 years ago, Joseph was sold into slavery. Now think back to what you were doing 13 years ago. I would have been about to turn 17, which means I would have been in my second year of college. Wow, doing my A-levels. That seems like a day and an age ago. Think about what you were doing 13 years ago. Now imagine from that point to now, all those 13 years, imagine enduring such hardship for all of that time that Joseph went through. Like the pain of being betrayed by his brothers, and then being a slave in Egypt, and then being falsely accused, and then being thrown in prison and left in prison for multiple years. And yet, during that time, we see Joseph, even in the midst of that difficulty, still seek God. And he still seems to have a relationship with God and seems to be walking with God. And we know clearly that the text says that God was with him. And we see that God is using it for a purpose, that suffering he experienced. You see, sometimes the redemption we're waiting for doesn't arrive till years later. Sometimes the redemption we're waiting for doesn't arrive in our lifetime. Sometimes we don't see it this side of heaven. But if we have put our trust in Jesus, we know that he loves us. We know that he's with us. We know he's using it for a purpose, even if we can't see it. And our job is not to know exactly everything that God is doing right now in any given situation. Yes, there's many times he reveals what he's doing, but there are so many other things he's doing that we could not fully comprehend or see or fathom right now. Our job is not to know exactly everything he's doing, but rather our job is to continue to walk with him in trust and in faith. As we see, Joseph is a great example of that. How Joseph didn't just seek God when things were going well or walk with God when things were going good, but rather he walked with God even in the midst of difficulty. He could testify when he gets to the end of his life that God was with him and God used it for a purpose. Now, in verse 47, now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly, so he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. So Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. You see, it happened just as God had said, 7 years of abundance. And during these 7 years of abundance, under the command and kind of oversight of Joseph, they gather and they store the food that they have. And also during this time, Joseph has 2 sons. And to Joseph were born 2 sons, verse 50, before the years of the famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, a priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. In some cultures, or in many cultures, names have great significance. And parents in those cultures, parents choosing to name their children, not just because their name sounds nice, but rather often in some cultures they choose the name specifically because that name has a specific meaning. For example, my name is Daniel. I think my parents just chose Daniel because they liked the name, but the name Daniel has a meaning. The name Daniel means God judges, or God is my judge. And in Joseph's naming of his children, we get insight really into Joseph's heart and mind at the time, and how Joseph is processing things, because he chooses these names for a reason. And the first son he chooses is Manasseh, and the name Manasseh basically sounds like the Hebrew word for forget. And this is why he says that, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. There seems to be that Joseph is beginning to move on, having this new life now, a new life in Egypt. And such is this new life that in some ways it begins to kind of heal the pain of what has come before. I mean, he still knows what happened to him, but the joy that he's experiencing now outweighs the difficulties that he has experienced. So as he's now beginning to move on and have his own family, he says, God has made me forget all my toil, all my father's house. And then the name of his second child was called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Joseph was afflicted. He suffered. And yet God was able, in the midst of that land of suffering, to bring about fruitfulness, to bring about fruit. You've caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. God, even in the midst of our afflictions, can bear fruit from our lives. Fruit, lasting, beautiful, spiritual fruit. And in verse 53 says this, then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, the famine was in all the land, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So 7 years of plenty, remember? And 7 years of famine. These have happened just as God had said. God is always true to his word. And as the famine comes, Egypt's prepared. And this famine isn't just affected Egypt, this has affected people across the world. And so, when the famine hits, Egypt has the food prepared and reserved and saved so that now they have food. And what we see is that the Egyptians, it's not just the Egyptians who are now going to Joseph for food, but it says this in verse 57 as we come to a close of our text. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all lands. The famine is severe everywhere. And as a result, people are coming to Egypt. They're coming to Joseph for food. God has prepared Joseph and has prepared and has been working through Joseph, leading him to this event that he would be now in a position not just to give salvation from the famine to the Egyptians, but then also to the world around. And Joseph, most likely at this point, he started this new life. He's kind of put aside what has taken place to him with his brothers. He's kind of said, look, that's the past now. I'm now moving on. Not realizing that God isn't finished. This story isn't over. And actually, God is positioning Joseph not just to save the Egyptians, but God is positioning Joseph to save the very brothers who sold him into slavery. Because as this famine spreads to them, Joseph's family, they, as we will see next week, will turn to the only place where there is food, that is Egypt. And they will come before the person who is overseeing the distribution of the food, and that is Joseph. God is maneuvering the pieces for an amazing reunion, which we'll see next week. But as we finish, as I say, we are reminded that God is able, that God is a God of the great reversal. And there is no greater reversal than what Jesus did at the cross. And what we see Jesus do with the resurrection. Because that is the greatest reversal. Here, an innocent man, Jesus, on the cross, dying for the world, dying for the sins of the world, for our sin, in our place, brutally murdered and buried. And then in the greatest reversal, Jesus comes back to life, proving that he has conquered death, proving that he has conquered the grave, so that anybody who puts their faith and trust in Jesus can be forgiven and experience the reversal inside our hearts of turning from spiritually dead people to spiritually alive, to people who wanted nothing to do with God, to people who love God and seek to follow him. From people who are dead in their sins to people who are forgiven of their sin. You see, our God is a great Saviour. Our God is a God of the reversal. Let us pray together.